The funny thing about foreclosure parties is that they always look like victory right up until the paperwork changes hands. I remember the smell first. Expensive champagne, fresh landscaping mulch, charcoal smoke drifting from stainless steel grills that cost more than my first pickup truck. The celebration was happening less than 300 yards from my farmhouse, right on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, where the HOA board had gathered beneath a white event tent to celebrate something they thought was already theirs. My home, my land, my future. The late afternoon sun reflected off rows of spotless SUVs as laughter carried across the field. Someone even hired a local jazz trio. That was how confident they were. They weren't waiting for the court hearing. They weren't waiting for the final ruling. As far as they were concerned, the fight was already over. I stood on my front porch with a mug of black coffee warming my hands and watched them toast to my defeat. The old wooden boards beneath my boots creaked softly, the same boards my grandfather had repaired with his own hands nearly 40 years ago. Every scratch in that porch had a memory attached to it. Every fence post across those acres carried part of my family's history. But according to Victoria Kensington, none of that mattered anymore. At exactly 5:17 in the evening, I saw her step onto the small platform near the tent. Even from a distance, I could recognize her perfectly styled blonde hair and bright white blazer. Victoria never wore practical clothes. She dressed like every day was a television interview. The crowd quieted as she raised a crystal glass into the air. I couldn't hear every word from where I stood, but the wind carried enough. Tomorrow, she announced, smiling at the applause, the farmhouse officially becomes community property. More cheers followed. More glasses lifted into the air. Someone started clapping. I took another sip of coffee. The bitter taste lingered on my tongue while I watched my neighbors celebrate the idea of erasing a century of family ownership. What made the whole thing almost impressive was how quickly they had convinced themselves they were right. Willow Creek Estates hadn't existed 10 years earlier. Back then, this entire area had been open farmland, oak trees, and grazing cattle. Then developers arrived. New roads appeared. New houses followed. Soon there were hundreds of families living where cornfields once stood. And somewhere along the way, the HOA decided my farmhouse no longer fit their vision of progress. They called it an eyesore. They called it outdated. One board member actually described it as an obstacle to community growth during a public meeting. An obstacle. That word stayed with me. The farmhouse had survived droughts, recessions, storms, and 4 generations of Caldwells. Yet somehow it was the obstacle. A pickup rolled slowly down the gravel lane leading toward my property. I recognized the vehicle immediately. Daniel Brooks, lead attorney for the HOA. He wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to talk. He was delivering another stack of legal notices. The tires crunched against the gravel with deliberate confidence. He parked near the mailbox and stepped out carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. The evening air felt unusually still as he approached. Behind him, the music from the celebration continued floating across the field. Victoria's laughter echoed faintly through the warm Texas air. Daniel stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and adjusted his tie. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, offering a professional smile. "Tomorrow should finally resolve everything." I looked past him toward the celebration tent glowing beneath strings of decorative lights. Then I looked back at the folder in his hands. He thought this was the ending. Victoria thought this was the ending. Every person holding a champagne glass over there thought they were witnessing the final chapter. What none of them understood was that they had spent months trying to seize a farmhouse from the one man who quietly owned the institution, holding the mortgages on nearly every home in their neighborhood. The truth is, I never looked like the kind of man people associate with money. That was probably my greatest advantage. After Daniel drove away that evening, I sat in the old porch swing and listened to the distant music drifting across the pasture. The swing chains groaned softly with every movement. Crickets chirped from the tall grass. Somewhere near the western fence line, one of my horses snorted and settled in for the night. Everything about the farm felt familiar. Steady. Honest. The way it had always been. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 48 years old, born in the same farmhouse where I still lived. The kitchen still had sections of hardwood flooring my grandfather installed himself. The barn still carried the scent of aged timber, motor oil, and hay. The property covered nearly 120 acres, stretching beyond a small creek and rolling into fields that turned gold every autumn. To most people driving past on the county road, I was just another farmer refusing to sell. That assumption had followed me for years. The old Ford pickup, the worn boots, the faded denim jackets. People saw what they expected to see. They never asked many questions. My grandfather used to tell me that real wealth rarely announces itself. It sits quietly and lets other people do the talking. Back when developers first started buying land around the county, they came to me with offers almost every month. Some were polite, some were aggressive. One developer arrived in a helicopter and landed near the south pasture as if the noise alone would impress me. He offered enough money to retire 3 times over. I still said no. The farm was never just an investment. It was family. It was history. Every acre carried stories. Every fence line marked a memory. When my father passed away, I inherited more than land. I inherited responsibility. What nobody outside a small circle of advisors knew was that I had spent the last 20 years building something far beyond the county line. While everyone else saw a farmer, I spent countless evenings reviewing financial reports, acquisition proposals, and investment portfolios. I simply preferred doing those things from the same wooden desk overlooking a cornfield instead of a downtown skyscraper. The smell of fresh coffee and cut hay always beat marble offices and executive boardrooms. The next morning began before sunrise. The air felt cool against my face as I walked toward the barn. Dew covered the grass. The eastern horizon glowed orange behind the trees. Inside the barn, I fed the horses and checked equipment like I had done thousands of times before. Routine has a way of clearing your mind, especially when everyone around you is losing theirs. Around 7:30, my phone vibrated. The screen displayed a familiar name, James Whitmore. Most people knew him as the chief executive officer of Caldwell National Mortgage Holdings. Financial magazines occasionally called him one of the most influential banking executives in the Southwest. To me, he was simply James. We had worked together for nearly 15 years. I answered while tightening a gate latch. "Good morning, Ethan," he said. His voice carried the calm professionalism that made investors trust him with billions. "I assume you saw the latest filing." I looked across the pasture toward Willow Creek Estates. Even from this distance, I could see construction crews preparing another row of houses. "I saw it." James paused. "The board wants to know if we are intervening." I smiled. "Not yet." Another pause. Then a quiet chuckle. "They really have no idea, do they?" "No," I said. "They do not." After the call ended, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued working. The funny thing about power is that most people imagine it as something loud. Big offices, security details, television interviews, expensive suits. Victoria Kensington believed that too. She measured influence by appearances. That was why she never understood the danger she was creating. As the morning sun climbed higher, I watched residents leave Willow Creek Estates for work. Luxury sedans rolled through the entrance gates. Contractors arrived at new construction sites. Delivery trucks moved in and out. An entire neighborhood going about its normal day. What none of them realized was that nearly every mortgage payment flowing out of those homes eventually led back to the same quiet farmhouse they were trying so hard to erase. Victoria Kensington did not become president of Willow Creek Estates by being patient. She became president because she believed every problem had a solution and every person had a price. Unfortunately for her, I was neither. The real conflict started 2 years before that celebration party. At first, it came wrapped in polite language and expensive stationery. I still remember the crisp texture of the envelope and the faint scent of printer ink when I opened the first letter. The HOA board wanted to discuss a mutually beneficial opportunity regarding future community development. Translation: they wanted my land. Victoria arrived at the farmhouse a week later driving a pearl white luxury SUV that looked completely out of place beside my weathered barn. She stepped out wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill and smiled as if she were doing me a favor simply by standing on my porch. The summer air smelled like fresh cut grass and warm soil as she handed me a folder filled with development proposals. According to her presentation, the farm represented the final missing piece in Willow Creek Estates' expansion plan. Walking trails, community gardens, a private lake, luxury homes. She talked for nearly 30 minutes without once asking what I wanted. When she finally finished, I thanked her for the offer and told her the property was not for sale. Her smile never disappeared, but something behind her eyes changed. It was subtle, quick, like a door quietly closing. From that moment on, everything became personal. The first violation notice arrived 3 weeks later. Apparently, the barn roof violated updated community aesthetic standards despite the fact that my property existed decades before the HOA. Then came complaints about agricultural equipment visibility. After that, complaints about fencing. Then noise complaints from residents who purchased homes next to an active farm and somehow became surprised when farms operated like farms. Every few weeks, another certified letter appeared in my mailbox. Every few weeks, another legal theory emerged explaining why my property no longer fit within the vision of the community. I noticed a pattern quickly. Victoria never attacked directly. She preferred layers. Pressure, paperwork, administrative headaches. She treated legal notices the way some people collect souvenirs. By the end of the first year, I had accumulated enough correspondence to fill an entire filing cabinet drawer. The funny part was how predictable it became. The smell of fresh coffee would barely fill the kitchen before another envelope appeared. Another inspection, another complaint, another demand. My attorney reviewed everything and shook his head more than once. Most of the claims lacked substance. But Victoria understood something important. Winning every battle was unnecessary. Making life difficult was enough. Then the neighborhood started changing. New residents arrived every month. Construction crews worked from sunrise until evening. Nail guns echoed across former pastureland. Concrete trucks rumbled down roads that used to be gravel trails. Willow Creek estates grew larger, wealthier, more influential. And with every new phase of development, my farmhouse became more valuable to Victoria's plans. During one HOA meeting, she publicly displayed a proposed expansion map. A neighbor later sent me a photograph. My property sat directly in the center, highlighted in bright yellow. Future Community Recreation District. Not farmhouse. Not family property. Not private land. Just empty space waiting to be absorbed. I pinned that photograph above my desk. Not because it worried me. Because it reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. By the second year, the campaign escalated. HOA attorneys filed new actions. Consultants submitted reports. Surveyors appeared near property lines. Every step moved slightly further than the one before. Victoria acted as if ownership itself were a technicality that could eventually be negotiated away. Yet every time another notice arrived, another curious thing happened somewhere else. Residents throughout Willow Creek estates began receiving routine mortgage correspondence, refinancing offers, account reviews, payment updates. Perfectly normal banking business. Nobody connected those letters to the farm sitting beside their neighborhood. Nobody connected them to me. And Victoria certainly never imagined that while she spent her days building a case against one stubborn farmer, she was unknowingly building a much larger problem for herself. The pressure campaign reached its peak during the 6 months leading up to the court hearing. Every morning seemed to arrive with a new complication attached to it. The smell of damp soil and fresh coffee had become permanently associated with legal paperwork. One rainy Tuesday, I opened my mailbox and found 3 separate notices waiting inside. One involved a revised land use complaint. Another questioned drainage compliance. The third alleged that portions of my fencing created visual inconsistency with neighboring properties. I stood there in the drizzle reading documents that would have sounded ridiculous to anyone unfamiliar with HOA politics. Yet each notice carried attorney letterhead and official language designed to make every accusation feel serious. Victoria understood something most people did not. The process itself could become punishment. Even when claims failed, responding required time. Meetings required time. Lawyers required time. Inspections required time. The strategy was not necessarily to win quickly. The strategy was to wear me down until surrender felt easier than resistance. Meanwhile, Willow Creek estates continued expanding. New homes appeared almost monthly. Fresh sod covered former pastureland. Decorative streetlights lined roads that did not exist 2 years earlier. Every time another phase opened, real estate advertisements highlighted luxury living beside scenic farmland. My farmland. They used photographs of my fields and promotional materials while simultaneously trying to remove me from the picture. One afternoon, I attended a county zoning meeting where Victoria presented another proposal. The room smelled faintly of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. Ceiling fans hummed overhead while residents filled rows of folding chairs. Victoria stood confidently at the podium describing future growth opportunities. Her presentation included maps, traffic studies, architectural renderings, and economic projections. Then she displayed an image that caught everyone's attention. A concept drawing showing a future community center positioned directly where my farmhouse stood. Not beside it, not near it, on top of it. Several people turned toward me. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. Victoria never even glanced in my direction. She acted as though the outcome had already been decided. After the meeting, a retired teacher named Carol Henderson approached me in the parking lot. She had lived in Willow Creek Estates since the first phase opened. Rain clouds gathered overhead while she stood holding an umbrella against the wind. "Ethan," she said quietly, "are they really going to take your farm?" I looked across the lot toward Victoria's vehicle. She was laughing with board members while loading presentation materials into the back. "I do not know, Carol," I replied, "but they seem determined to try." Carol frowned. Then she said something that stayed with me. "They keep talking like everything belongs to them." The funny thing was that many residents had started noticing the same attitude. What began as concern about one farmhouse gradually turned into questions about HOA leadership. Assessments increased. Fees increased. Legal expenses increased. Yet Victoria always seemed eager to pursue another fight. The board approved consultant contracts, survey contracts, legal reviews, public relations expenses. The money flowed steadily. During the same period, something else continued happening in the background. Routine mortgage notices, refinancing updates, lending reviews, standard banking correspondence arriving in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood. Most people ignored them. Why would they not? Mortgages were simply part of life. Nobody connected those envelopes to the broader conflict unfolding around them. Nobody understood the relationship between their monthly payments and the farmhouse sitting beyond the eastern property line. Then came the filing that changed everything. Daniel Brooks submitted a motion seeking accelerated action against my property. The language sounded dramatic. Continued noncompliance, community harm, development obstruction. Reading through the paperwork late one evening, I could almost hear Victoria's voice behind every sentence. The grandfather clock in my living room ticked steadily while rain tapped against the windows. Outside, the barn lights cast long shadows across the pasture. Inside, I reviewed page after page of accusations. Most lacked merit. Some stretched logic beyond recognition. Yet together they created a narrative. A stubborn farmer refusing progress. A landowner standing in the way of community interests. The story sounded convincing if you ignored the facts. A few days later, James Whitmore called again. This time his voice carried a slightly different tone. Not concern. Anticipation. "The legal team completed its review," he said. And I asked, "Everything is ready whenever you decide." I walked toward the porch and looked across the fields glowing beneath the setting sun. Beyond them sat Willow Creek Estates, preparing for another board meeting. Another strategy session. Another attempt to tighten the trap. "Let them continue," I said. There was a brief silence before James laughed softly. "Sometimes, Ethan, I forget how patient you are." I watched headlights move through neighborhood streets as dusk settled over the county. The trap was tightening exactly the way Victoria wanted. What she never realized was that she had spent years building it around herself. The closer we got to the hearing date, the quieter I became. That silence confused people. Victoria expected outrage. The HOA board expected emergency motions, public statements, maybe even settlement offers. Instead, I kept feeding horses, repairing fences, and drinking coffee on the porch every morning. The smell of cedar from the old barn mixed with the cool autumn air while leaves drifted across the pasture. From the outside, it looked like I had accepted defeat. That assumption spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Rumors traveled faster than facts in that neighborhood. Some residents claimed I had already hired moving companies. Others said developers were negotiating final construction plans for the land. A few even discussed future home sites where my farmhouse currently stood. One Saturday afternoon, I drove into town for feed supplies and stopped at a small diner near the courthouse. The familiar smell of bacon, coffee, and fresh biscuits filled the room. As I waited for my order, two men at a nearby table were discussing future property values. One of them unfolded a brochure showing concept renderings for a planned recreation complex. Right in the center sat a green space occupying the exact location of my property. Neither man recognized me. They talked openly about how much nicer the area would look once the old farm disappeared. I listened quietly and finished my coffee. The funny thing was that they were not malicious. They simply believed the story they had been told. Progress, growth, community improvement. Victoria had spent years shaping that narrative. Back at the farm, another curious pattern continued developing. Every few days, someone from Willow Creek Estates received correspondence from Caldwell National Mortgage Holdings. Some notices involved escrow reviews. Others involved refinancing opportunities. A few residents received routine account audits required under lending guidelines. Perfectly normal business. Yet the timing started creating confusion. Carol Henderson mentioned it during a conversation near the county post office. "Ethan, have you noticed how many people keep getting letters from the bank lately?" I shrugged. "Banks send letters all the time." She nodded. "True. It just feels strange. Everyone is talking about it." That evening, I sat in my study reviewing financial reports while rain tapped softly against the windows. The room smelled faintly of leather-bound books and old wood polish. On my desk sat several folders prepared by attorneys and compliance specialists. Everything had been verified, every record checked, every document organized. Years of financial relationships connected Willow Creek Estates to institutions most residents never thought about. People focus on houses. They rarely think about the invisible structures supporting those houses. Loans, liens, lending agreements, development financing, construction credit lines. Entire neighborhoods operate on foundations few people ever see. My phone rang shortly after 9 o'clock. James Whitmore again. This time he sounded amused. "You might enjoy this," he said. "Enjoy what?" "The HOA board applied for another financing review." I leaned back in my chair. "Through whom?" James laughed softly. "Us." I looked out the window toward distant neighborhood lights glowing through the darkness. Victoria was spending enormous amounts of time and money trying to remove me from the community. At the same time, organizations connected to her neighborhood continued relying on financial services ultimately controlled by the very person she was targeting. The irony would have been funny if she had understood it. A week before the hearing, Willow Creek Estates hosted another public gathering at the clubhouse. Music drifted across the fields long after sunset. Cars filled every available parking space. Through binoculars from my porch, I watched residents mingle beneath decorative lights while board members moved through the crowd accepting congratulations. Victoria stood near the entrance greeting guests like a politician celebrating election night. Her confidence was impossible to miss. She genuinely believed victory was days away. What she did not know was that several legal teams had already completed preparations. Financial records were ready. Ownership structures were documented. Lending agreements were indexed. Every piece sat exactly where it needed to be. The trap she believed was closing around me had reached its final stage. And just as James predicted, nobody in Willow Creek Estates had the slightest idea what was waiting inside the courthouse when the hearing finally began. The morning of the hearing arrived with the smell of rain-soaked earth drifting through the open kitchen window. I woke before sunrise, poured a cup of coffee, and stood at the same sink where my grandfather used to read weather reports before heading out to the fields. Outside, a light fog hung over the pasture. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. Solid, quiet, unmoved by the noise surrounding it. That was the strange thing about the entire situation. Everyone else seemed nervous except me. By 8 o'clock, the county courthouse parking lot was already filling with vehicles. The air smelled faintly of wet pavement and fresh-cut grass from the maintenance crews working nearby. As I walked toward the entrance, I spotted Victoria almost immediately. She stood near the courthouse steps surrounded by board members, attorneys, and several residents from Willow Creek Estates. Their expressions carried the same confidence I had seen at the celebration party. Daniel Brooks was reviewing documents while Victoria greeted supporters as though she were attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony instead of a legal hearing. When she noticed me approaching, her smile widened. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she called out. "Big day." I nodded politely. "It certainly is." She glanced toward Daniel and then back at me. There was no hostility in her voice anymore. Only certainty. The kind people develop when they convince themselves the outcome has already been decided. Inside the courthouse, the familiar scent of old paper, polished wood, and air conditioning filled the hallways. Attorneys moved between courtrooms carrying folders and briefcases. Conversations echoed off marble walls. Everything felt routine, ordinary. Yet I knew something nobody else in that building understood. The hearing began shortly after 9. Victoria sat with the HOA representatives. Daniel presented arguments first. He spoke confidently, outlining years of complaints, zoning disputes, development concerns, and alleged community impacts. Charts appeared. Maps appeared. Photographs appeared. Every piece carefully arranged to support the narrative they had spent years constructing. The old farmhouse represented an obstacle. Progress required change. The community deserved expansion. Listening from my seat, I almost admired the effort. Daniel was skilled. Victoria had invested enormous resources building her case. When he finally finished, several HOA members exchanged satisfied looks. They believed they had delivered the decisive blow. Then the judge turned toward my side of the room. "Counsel?" he asked. My attorney, Rebecca Langford, stood slowly. Rebecca had spent months preparing for this moment. Calm, methodical, impossible to rattle. The soft rustle of paper echoed through the courtroom as she opened a single folder. "Your Honor," she began, "before addressing the property issues raised today, we believe the court should understand several financial relationships directly connected to this matter." Victoria's smile faded slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift. Rebecca continued. She introduced ownership records, corporate filings, regulatory disclosures, certified documentation, one exhibit after another. The courtroom grew quieter with every page. Daniel stopped taking notes. Victoria leaned forward. The judge reviewed documents carefully. Then Rebecca displayed the first organizational chart. It traced ownership from several lending entities through multiple holding companies. Complex, but entirely legitimate. The lines eventually converged at a single name: Ethan Caldwell. For a moment, nobody reacted. People often need time to process information that does not fit their assumptions. Rebecca calmly explained that Caldwell National Mortgage Holdings operated as the parent institution overseeing significant residential lending activity throughout the region. She then presented the next chart. This one focused specifically on Willow Creek Estates. The silence became almost tangible. You could hear the ventilation system humming above the courtroom. You could hear pages turning at the clerk's desk. Victoria stared at the screen without blinking. Rebecca continued speaking in the same measured tone. Construction financing, development lending, community facility loans, residential mortgages. Layer after layer appeared. Then came the final exhibit. A summary report identifying the lending relationships tied directly to properties inside Willow Creek Estates. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied the document. Across the room, Daniel's expression changed completely. Victoria looked as though someone had replaced the floor beneath her with glass. Because for the first time since this entire conflict began, they were no longer looking at a farmer sitting quietly in a courtroom. They were looking at the man whose financial institution stood behind much of the neighborhood they had spent years trying to use against him. For several seconds, nobody in the courtroom spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument Daniel Brooks had presented all morning. I could hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hallway. Victoria remained frozen in her chair, staring at the ownership chart displayed on the monitor. The confidence that had carried her through years of meetings, complaints, and legal filings seemed to drain away one piece at a time. Rebecca allowed the room to absorb the information before moving to the next exhibit. The screen changed again. This time the documents focused specifically on Willow Creek Estates. Parcel numbers, loan agreements, development financing records, community infrastructure funding. Everything carefully organized and independently verified. Rebecca pointed to one section after another while explaining how the neighborhood had been financed during its expansion years. The original developer had borrowed funds. The builders had borrowed funds. The clubhouse project had borrowed funds. Several community improvement projects had borrowed funds. None of that was unusual. Growing communities depend on financing. What made the room uncomfortable was discovering where much of that financing ultimately originated. The judge studied each document carefully. Daniel's legal pad remained untouched. He had stopped writing entirely. Across the gallery, several residents exchanged confused looks. They were beginning to understand that this hearing was no longer about a farmhouse. It was becoming something much larger. Rebecca then presented a summary report prepared by financial auditors. The numbers told a story Victoria never bothered to investigate. More than two-thirds of the occupied homes in Willow Creek Estates carried mortgages serviced through institutions operating under the Caldwell National umbrella. The community clubhouse financing agreement traced back to the same network. Several commercial contracts connected to neighborhood development traced back there as well. Even ongoing expansion projects relied on lending relationships established years earlier. Nobody had hidden any of it. The information had always existed in public filings. Nobody simply thought to look. Victoria finally leaned toward Daniel and whispered something urgently. He reviewed a document, flipped several pages, then reviewed it again. The expression on his face told me everything. He was not finding a mistake. He was confirming the problem. Rebecca continued. She explained that ownership alone was not the issue before the court. The issue was motive. For years, the HOA had portrayed me as an unreasonable obstacle to progress, while simultaneously targeting a property owner whose financial institutions maintained significant relationships throughout the very community attempting to remove him. The judge listened carefully. Then came the document that truly changed the atmosphere. Rebecca displayed a list of active financial obligations connected directly to the HOA itself. Annual maintenance financing, facility improvements, operational credit arrangements. Every line was legitimate. Every line documented. Every line reviewed by independent counsel. The room grew quieter with each page. Victoria looked as though she had suddenly realized she had entered a chess match while believing she was playing checkers. The most revealing moment arrived when Rebecca identified one particular lending relationship tied to a recent clubhouse renovation project. Several board members visibly reacted. They recognized the project immediately because they had approved it. What they apparently never understood was who ultimately stood behind the financing structure. Rebecca closed the folder and returned to counsel table. She had not raised her voice once. She had not needed dramatic language. Facts were doing all the work. The judge requested a short recess. Chairs shifted. Conversations erupted throughout the courtroom. Residents gathered in small groups, trying to process what they had just learned. Reporters who had attended expecting a routine property dispute suddenly found themselves chasing a much more interesting story. Victoria remained seated. For the first time since I had met her, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant. Uncertain. As people filed into the hallway, my phone vibrated. A message from James Whitmore appeared on the screen. It contained only 5 words. They finally understand the picture. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked through the courthouse window toward Willow Creek Estates in the distance. For years, Victoria believed she was forcing a stubborn farmer into a corner. What she never realized was that every step she took brought her closer to discovering just how much of her neighborhood was connected to the man she had spent so much time trying to remove. The recess lasted less than 30 minutes, but by the time everyone returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. The smell of coffee from the courthouse lobby drifted through the hallway as people hurried back to their seats carrying phones, folders, and a growing sense that they had just witnessed the beginning of something much larger than a property dispute. Victoria entered looking different. Her posture remained straight, but the effortless confidence she carried for years had vanished. Daniel Brooks walked beside her, flipping through documents at a pace that suggested he was searching for answers that should have been found months ago. The hearing resumed, but the focus had shifted. The judge began asking questions that nobody on the HOA side seemed prepared to answer. Questions about board expenditures. Questions about consultant contracts. Questions about legal authorizations. Questions about how much money had been spent pursuing a single homeowner over multiple years. The answers became increasingly uncomfortable. Rebecca remained calm. She simply introduced additional records that had been gathered during discovery. Bank statements, meeting minutes, vendor invoices, board approvals. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden, just documents. Yet those documents painted a picture that several residents sitting in the gallery clearly did not like. One project led to another. One invoice connected to another. Several expenses appeared unrelated to any legitimate community purpose. By lunchtime, whispers were spreading through the courtroom. The sound reminded me of wind moving through dry cornfields before a storm. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. The most damaging information came from within the HOA itself. Over the years, Victoria had justified legal actions by claiming they protected property values. But several board expenditures showed funds being directed toward repeated enforcement campaigns that generated little benefit for residents. Thousands of dollars spent on consultants. Thousands more on repeated legal reviews. Additional money allocated toward development proposals involving land the HOA never owned. The deeper attorneys looked, the worse it appeared. A retired accountant from Willow Creek Estates requested permission to review certain financial records after hearing testimony. Then another resident asked questions. Then another. The community that once applauded Victoria's leadership suddenly wanted explanations. Outside the courthouse, local reporters gathered near the entrance. Cameras appeared. Microphones appeared. The story was no longer about an old farmhouse. It had become a story about leadership, accountability, and money. By late afternoon, county officials announced reviews of several administrative filings connected to prior HOA actions. Nothing criminal had been established. Nothing sensational. But enough concerns existed to justify further examination. That announcement landed like a thunderclap. Victoria's supporters grew noticeably quieter. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others left before proceedings ended. Back at Willow Creek Estates, the effects appeared almost immediately. Residents who had spent years trusting board decisions began requesting records. Community message boards filled with questions. Financial reports were shared. Meeting attendance increased. People wanted transparency. They wanted explanations. Most of all, they wanted to know why so much time and money had been spent targeting a single property owner. 3 days later, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. The clubhouse parking lot overflowed with vehicles. The smell of freshly watered landscaping mixed with humid evening air as residents packed every available seat. Several homeowners stood along the walls because there was no room left. Victoria attempted to maintain control of the meeting, but every answer created new questions. Residents challenged expenses. Residents challenged decisions. Residents challenged priorities. The authority she once exercised without resistance was slipping away in real time. Then came the vote that truly changed everything. Board members facing mounting pressure agreed to commission a full independent review of HOA finances and governance procedures. The motion passed overwhelmingly. The room erupted into conversation. Not celebration. Not anger. Relief. People finally felt like they were seeing the full picture. As for me, I spent that evening exactly where I always preferred to be. Sitting on the farmhouse porch while the sun disappeared behind the western pasture. The smell of cut hay drifted across the fields. Crickets filled the evening air. Beyond the trees, neighborhood lights flickered on one by one across Willow Creek Estates. For years, Victoria believed power came from controlling other people. What she never understood was that real power depends on trust. And once a community starts asking questions, trust becomes very difficult to recover. 6 months later, the farmhouse was still standing exactly where it had always stood. The porch boards still creaked beneath my boots. The barn still smelled like timber, hay, and machine oil. Every sunrise still rolled across the eastern fields and painted the pasture in shades of gold. Some things had changed, though. Willow Creek Estates looked different now. Not physically. The houses were still there. The streets were still there. The clubhouse still overlooked the community pond. What changed was the atmosphere. The illusion had disappeared. Once residents started asking questions, they kept asking them. The independent review uncovered years of poor decision-making, unnecessary legal spending, and governance practices that many homeowners considered unacceptable. Several board members resigned before the review even concluded. Others chose not to seek re-election. Victoria Kensington lasted longer than most expected, but not by much. The woman who once controlled every meeting eventually found herself sitting in the audience, while homeowners voted on reforms she could no longer stop. I attended only one of those meetings. The clubhouse smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee. Folding chairs filled the room. Residents who rarely spoke during the old days now stood confidently at the microphone. They discussed budgets, transparency, accountability, community priorities, real priorities, not personal grudges disguised as neighborhood improvement projects. Victoria sat quietly near the back. For the first time since I met her, she looked like an ordinary resident instead of a self-appointed ruler. We never argued. We never exchanged dramatic speeches. There was no need. Reality had done all the talking. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck outside her house. Workers loaded furniture while neighbors walked dogs along the sidewalk pretending not to watch. The air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and summer heat. Victoria left Willow Creek Estates shortly afterward. No public farewell. No final statement. Just a quiet departure from the neighborhood she once believed she controlled. As for the financial side of things, many people expected some sort of retaliation. They expected me to use my position to punish the community. That assumption always amused me. The goal was never revenge. The goal was simply to protect what belonged to my family. Lending agreements remained unchanged. Mortgage payments continued exactly as before. Residents kept living their lives. Children kept riding bicycles through the neighborhood. Families kept hosting cookouts on weekends. The world did not end because people finally learned the truth. In many ways, it improved. One afternoon, nearly a year after the hearing, Carol Henderson stopped by the farmhouse carrying a homemade pie. The smell of cinnamon filled the kitchen as we sat at the old table near the window. She looked across the fields and smiled. You know, Ethan, most people still cannot believe you never told anyone. Told them what? I asked. About the bank. About everything. I laughed and looked toward the pasture outside. A horse wandered slowly near the fence line while a warm breeze moved through the grass. It never seemed important, I said. Carol shook her head and smiled. Maybe that is why it mattered. After she left, I walked out onto the porch and watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. Beyond the trees, Willow Creek Estates glowed beneath the evening light. The same neighborhood that once celebrated my defeat now existed peacefully beside the farm. No lawsuits, no threats, no expansion maps, just neighbors living their lives. I thought about that celebration party from long ago. The music, the champagne, the certainty. They believed ownership came from paperwork they had not earned. They believed influence came from titles they had given themselves. They believed power came from making other people smaller. They were wrong about all three. Real ownership is stewardship. Real influence is responsibility. Real power does not need to announce itself. The evening air carried the scent of fresh earth across the fields as darkness slowly settled over the farm. The lights of Willow Creek Estates flickered on one by one in the distance. I took a sip of coffee and listened to the familiar sounds of home. Crickets, wind, quiet. The farmhouse remained exactly where my grandfather left it. The land remained exactly where my family built its future. And the lesson Victoria never understood was the same lesson my grandfather taught me decades earlier. Power does not shout. Power signs the paper, closes the folder, and goes back to work.